The old library clock was stuck at 4:17. It had been for months. Mr. Elias, the quiet janitor with hands that once played Chopin with a soul, never bothered to fix it. He simply swept around it, his broom a metronome for the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Every morning, the silence was his only company, a heavy blanket he had pulled over himself ever since the music stopped. His movements were precise, methodical, a dance of a man trying to disappear inside his own routine. He emptied the trash, rearranged forgotten books, and polished the ancient mahogany tables where generations of children had dreamed. He was a ghost in a cathedral of stories, his own story having been erased long ago. The only sound he made was a soft sigh, and even that was swallowed by the vast, echoing quiet. The world knew him as the janitor, the silent keeper of the books, but no one knew he was the keeper of a deeper silence, one he had built with his own 2 hands. He hadn't spoken a single word to anyone in days. His face, etched with a quiet grief, was a mask he wore for a world that had forgotten how to look. He moved through the aisles of fiction and poetry as if they were a foreign land, a place filled with emotions he no longer possessed. Elias was a man who used to teach the young to feel music, to understand the harmony of a well-strung chord, but now he only knew the discord of a life unplayed. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The library, his sanctuary, was also his cage. He was a man who had mastered the art of being invisible, a man who had traded his identity as a musician for the anonymity of a broom and a dustpan. His world was a series of closed doors, locked rooms, and dusty windows, each one a testament to a life he had purposefully muted. But that morning, something was different. A small, crumpled note was left on his cleaning cart. Not a complaint or a request, but a drawing of a piano. A single, solitary key was drawn with a childlike hand, a small, imperfect circle where the note C should have been. Elias stared at it, his stoic facade cracking for just a moment. It was an anomaly in his perfectly ordered, silent world, a small, intrusive detail that refused to be swept away. The note wasn't a demand, it was a question, an unspoken plea that pierced through the armor of his silence. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, not anger, not sadness, but a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor of curiosity. This small, forgotten piece of paper was a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. It was the first time in a very long time that a voice, even a silent one, had reached him. If you've ever lost something that felt like part of your soul, stay with this story. This isn't just about a janitor. It's about a man who has buried a beautiful part of himself, and a small, unexpected gesture that might just be the thing to bring it back to life. It's about what happens when the past isn't just a memory, but a presence that demands to be acknowledged. This story is for anyone who has ever felt invisible, for anyone who has ever forgotten their own music. It's about the silent echoes of a love that was lost, and the quiet, persistent hope that one day those echoes might sound again. Stay with me, because what he finds next might just break you in the best way. He saw the drawing, and for the first time in years, the silence wasn't quite so absolute. It was a faint, high-pitched hum, like a distant memory struggling to be heard. The note was a small rebellion against his carefully constructed wall of emotional detachment. He remembered the last time his hands had touched a piano, the day they buried his daughter Lily. She had a laugh that was a melody, a spirit that was a sonata, and a love for music that was a reflection of his own. He had promised her he'd teach her to play Fur, Elise, when her fingers were big enough to reach the keys. But a car crash on a rainy afternoon had shattered that promise, silencing not just her laughter, but his music as well. He packed up her small piano, covered it with a sheet, and buried the musician he once was alongside her. The silence he had cultivated in his life was a penance, a way of punishing himself for not being able to protect her, for not being there to say goodbye. The guilt was a heavy, invisible chain that he dragged with him every day, and the silence was its constant clinking reminder. He found the child the next day, a small girl with eyes that held the same quiet determination as the drawing he'd found. She was sitting on the floor in the children's section, surrounded by books, a silent island in a sea of stories. Her name was Maya, and she was always there, a tiny, unobtrusive presence that Elias had never truly noticed. She didn't speak, not to him, not to anyone. She communicated with drawings, small, intricate illustrations of her world. This time, she wasn't drawing a piano. She was drawing him, broom in hand, surrounded by what looked like musical notes floating like snowflakes. She held the drawing up to him, a silent offering, a question. He saw a part of himself reflected in her quietness, a kindred spirit in the vast ocean of human indifference. The loneliness he carried felt for a moment a little less his own. He realized that they were both ghosts, haunting the same quiet halls, but for different reasons. That afternoon, he found another drawing taped to the piano in the library's corner, the one he polished but never touched. It was a drawing of a hand, his hand playing the keys. Below it, a single word was scribbled in shaky letters: play. The request, so simple and direct, hit him like a physical blow. It was the first time someone had asked something of him that wasn't about cleaning, about sweeping, about disappearing. It was an invitation to be something he had long buried. He looked at Maya, who was watching him from a distance, her gaze full of a profound understanding that transcended her years. He saw in her eyes not just an invitation, but a desperate need. A need for a melody, for a sound, for a connection that had been missing in both their lives. He realized that this wasn't just a child asking him to play a song. This was a small girl, a fellow wanderer in a world of silence, asking him to remember how to live. What would you do if the only way forward was through everything you'd buried? Keep watching, because this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant choice will change everything. It's about more than a man and a child. It's about the first note of a song long forgotten, the first step on a journey of healing that neither of them knew they needed to take. It's about the power of a single, simple request to shatter a lifetime of silence. Keep watching, because this is where the real story begins. This is where he has to choose between staying in the shadows or stepping back into the light. The decision he makes will not only change his life, but will be the symphony that finally breaks the silence that has consumed him for so long. Elias walked over to the old piano, his heart a dissonant chord of fear and longing. His fingers, calloused from a decade of scrubbing floors, hovered over the keys, a silent prayer. He remembered Lily's small hands, how they would search for the right notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. He remembered the sound of her laughter as a wrong note would slip out, a sound that was sweeter than any melody. The piano was a time machine, and with a single touch he was hurled back into the past, into the very memories he had so desperately tried to bury. He saw his daughter's bright, hopeful eyes and felt the warm weight of her head resting on his shoulder as he taught her the basics. The keys were no longer just ivory and wood. They were memories, each one a story, each one a tear he had refused to shed. The music he had so brutally silenced was screaming to be heard again, and this time he couldn't ignore it. He sat on the bench, his body stiff and reluctant. Maya, the quiet little girl, watched from a distance, her eyes mirroring the tension in his soul. He looked at her, and in her expectant gaze he saw a part of himself, a reflection of the child who once loved music with a fierce, unbridled passion. He realized she wasn't just asking him to play. She was asking him to live again. He gently pressed a key, the sound a faint, almost fearful whisper in the vast, echoing library. The note was shaky, unsure, but it was there. It was a single, perfect note of hope. He played another and another, his fingers slowly, timidly remembering the muscle memory of a lifetime. The first few chords were clumsy, a painful echo of a man out of practice, but as his hands moved, a melody began to form. It was a lullaby he had composed for Lily, a song he hadn't played since she was a baby. It was his song, his secret. He was playing his heart out, not for an audience, but for a small girl who saw him not as a janitor, but as a ghost of a musician. The old piano, silent for so long, had found its voice again, and in doing so, it had given a voice back to Elias. The melody was not just music, it was a confession, a eulogy, and a prayer all rolled into one. It was the sound of a man confronting his grief, not with silence and avoidance, but with the very thing he had given up. Maya walked over, a small, knowing smile on her face. She sat beside him, her tiny fingers gently placed on the keys. She didn't play, she just rested them there, a silent promise. She was there, not just to listen, but to be with him in his pain, to share in the difficult, beautiful process of healing. He saw his reflection in the polished surface of the piano, and for the first time in years, he didn't see a ghost. He saw a man, imperfect and broken, but a man with a purpose, a man with a story to tell, a man who was finally ready to start playing his own life's song again. The weight of the past was immense, but the quiet presence beside him made it feel, for the first time, bearable. Elias's hands, no longer stiff and hesitant, moved with a newfound purpose. He wasn't just playing for Maya, he was playing for Lily, for the promise he had broken, for the music he had silenced, and for the life he had buried. The melody was now more than a song. It was a conversation with his own soul, a difficult and honest dialogue about grief, guilt, and the slow, painstaking process of forgiveness. He finished the lullaby, the last note hanging in the air like a gentle whisper. He turned to Maya, and for the first time he spoke. His voice, raspy and unused, was barely a sound. "That was for her," he said, and the words, so simple and true, felt like a dam breaking inside him. Maya didn't reply with words. Instead, she took his hand and placed a small drawing in his palm, a drawing of a music school with his name on the sign. It was an unspoken invitation, a challenge, a plea. She had given him the gift of a new purpose, a reason to pick up the pieces and start building again. Elias had a choice to make. He could continue his silent life, retreating into the safe, numb routine of a janitor, or he could choose to feel again, to step out of the shadows and embrace the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of a man who had lost everything, but was willing to try to build something new. He looked at Maya, her eyes full of the kind of hope that only a child can possess, and saw his own reflection in their depths. He realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her, and about all the other silent children who needed a voice, who needed a melody, who needed to be seen. He finally understood that he had to choose life, not just for himself, but for her, for the memory of his daughter, for the music that was still sleeping inside his heart. He would not just clean the floors of the library, he would fill them with music again. He would teach the forgotten and the lonely, using the language of music to speak what words could not. He walked away from the library that day with nothing but the clothes on his back and the drawings from a small, silent girl. The old clock was still stuck at 4:17, but it didn't matter anymore. Time, for him, had started again. The man who had walked in that morning as a ghost, walked out as a teacher, a musician, and most importantly, a father to a silent child who had taught him how to live again. The world never saw him, but today you did. The world might never know his name or hear his music, but his story, a story of a silent man and a quiet girl, a story of grief and of hope, will resonate forever. Because sometimes all it takes to save a life is listening when no one else does. He didn't find happiness in the grand gesture or the applause of a crowd, but in the small, quiet and profound connection of two souls who had finally found their voice together.